Life in the city can be dangerous, especially if you live on the street. How to keep safe. Finding a place to sleep is the biggest challenge. Look for well-lit, well-trafficked areas. This ought to do it. But tonight, on the streets of Toronto, there is no safe place. A homeless man lies dying. This isn't the first time. It's the third in a series of murders that have terrorized the homeless in Toronto. 3 down. How many more to go? In true crime, investigation and conviction may take years. But every detective knows that the crucial clue is always there, somewhere in the first 72 hours. Bright lights, big city. For some people, it's exciting. For the homeless, it's a battleground where you're at the mercy of the very streets you call home. On this balmy night in June 2001, one homeless man has paid the ultimate price. The 911 call came in just after midnight. 2 hours later, Detective Jeff McGuire arrives at the scene.
First step is to liaise with the detectives there just to ensure the scene is properly protected. So we have an exchange of information with them and give them some direction and receive information. You still take a breath and go in before you have a look because it's not a pretty sight at all.
The uniformed officers have already cordoned off the street and begun interviewing bystanders. On a major downtown intersection like this one, they expect to find a witness. So far, nothing.
Can't believe that at midnight on a Sunday night on Bay Street in the biggest city in Canada, not one person saw this happen.
McGuire needs to know the victim's identity. In the bus shelter, no belongings to search. In the victim's pockets, no wallet. But the investigator knows homeless people often hide their valuables so they won't be ripped off. In the victim's sock, they find a wallet containing a bus pass and an ID. Now the victim has a name, Mr. Andrew Walker. First step in any investigation, understand your victim. Who he was might tell police who killed him. Andrew Walker made this downtown corner his home for months. People in the area saw him there every day.
It was just somebody who was there. He was part of my world. He was part of my neighborhood. As I would go to work, I would see him sitting on his favorite bench. He would watch you as you went by, and if you acknowledged him, he would acknowledge you. And I think that's why a number of people called him Santa Claus. He had that kind of open, jolly face, but he was a solitary character. I noticed that he would speak to an imaginary person.
From the people who worked in the area, McGuire has learned that he was a gentleman, a loner, possibly a mental patient. Police need to find his family to notify them of his death.
My partner contacted a number of different social agencies, and through welfare, he was able to determine that he had collected one emergency welfare check. On his application, there was a name and address. I believe it might have just been a town and a name of relatives in New Brunswick.
Andrew Walker was born in New Brunswick. He was very close to his mother, and when she fell ill, he stayed by her side until she died. He wanted to be a teacher, went to college but never finished. After her death 9 years ago, he disappeared. His family never heard from him again. Andrew Walker is the third homeless man murdered in as many months. His death galvanizes the public. If even a harmless, gentle soul like Andrew is at risk, should everyone be afraid?
Certainly raised concerns in our minds initially, and certainly in the media picked it up and ran pretty heavy with the potential that there was somebody out running around just aimlessly killing homeless people. It was something that we had to consider, but the only way to do that is to conduct your investigation of your murder.
From the autopsy, police learned that the cause of death is trauma to the head with a blunt object, consistent with the cobblestone, and a deep slash wound to the neck, consistent with a knife. There are no defensive wounds on the victim, suggesting he was asleep when attacked. Blood tests revealed that he had no alcohol or drugs in his system, which is unusual for a street person. So is Walker's rap sheet. He doesn't have one.
Not an intoxicated ticket, not anything, which is, I think, highly unusual for somebody to be able to live on the streets and just basically never get in anybody else's way. Generally end up, somebody complains about him, like he's in front of my building or he's sleeping in my garage. That just never happened with this guy.
With such a clean rap sheet, no evidence of robbery or struggle at the scene, it's becoming increasingly difficult to see what motive anyone could have had for murder. McGuire can reach only one conclusion. This was a random killing. It's a troubling way to begin a homicide investigation.
Motive is such a big key to an investigation because it leads you in a direction. It's the random killing, which makes it even more difficult and gives you more concern as an investigator because, again, it takes away any starting point from you.
All McGuire has to go on is whatever is collected in the first 24 hours at the crime scene. He needs to find a lead before this brutal killer murders again. A random, apparently motiveless murder of a homeless man on the streets of Toronto. At the crime scene, everything from cigarette butts to garbage in nearby containers to the murder weapon itself have been bagged and tagged for forensic testing, hoping something will yield that crucial physical link between the victim and his killer.
Ideally, we're looking for evidence of the suspect being in this area, or hanging out in this area, or living in this area, and to put him together with the victim.
Ident officers find fingerprints on the bus shelter. At a busy corner like this, they could be anyone's, but police need to cast a wide net. Some small bit of evidence that seems irrelevant now could be crucial later. Since the shelter is located just outside a complex of government buildings, there are dozens of security cameras trained on the area. McGuire hopes that one of these cameras got a picture of the killer. The day after the murder, surveillance tapes come in. Police know that a young man made a 911 call about the crime at 12:02 a.m. and that the victim died a few minutes later. The video shows a man walking through an exterior passageway around one of the government buildings at 12:05. If the killer struck just before midnight, then hurried away, he'd have ended up in these shots at just that time. So this could be the killer. But the footage doesn't show the man's face clearly enough to make a positive ID. For 22 hours, investigators have been combing the crime scene for evidence. Near the bus shelter, McGuire sees a row of cobblestones. One's clearly missing. It appears that the killer took the trouble to dig out a heavy cobblestone to bludgeon his victim to death. Nearby, an officer finds a discarded liquor bag, which is sent into the forensic center and tested by ident officer Larry Hicks. Hicks finds a clear print on the bag.
We examined the fingerprint and compared it to the fingerprint that I found inside the bus shelter the previous day, and the fingerprints belonged to the same person. And the hit came back to a known offender.
That person is identified on the police database as Daryl Rogney, also known as Daryl Callan, a man with a long string of convictions for violent crimes. He's an alcoholic vagrant with no fixed address. Police will have to act fast before he moves on. For one of the officers who worked at the crime scene, the name Daryl sparks a memory. An onlooker she interviewed on the night of the murder identified himself as Daryl Callan, one of the two names that came up on police records. Officer Feidenchuk remembers him clearly.
There was one particular party in the group who was just very boisterous, very loud, laughing, jovial. Not the behavior that you would expect to see at a crime scene. His explanation for being in the area was that he had spent his day drinking over at Queen's Park. I asked him about a red droplet a red stain droplet that he had on the sleeve of his Adidas jacket.
Since he was cooperating, she asked to see what he had in his knapsack, just to prove to her that he wasn't carrying a knife.
And the only request he made was that I be discreet about it, because he admitted to being a cross-dresser and that he had articles in the bags that he felt would embarrass him. He was so unusual. He made the hairs on my neck stand up. He was just too weird and too bizarre, but I mean, there was nothing else there than just a feeling.
You can't build a case on a feeling. McGuire needs more than Feidenchuk's hunch. He keeps in touch with the officers investigating the two other homeless killings to see if there's any connection. Daryl Rogney may be the key. He puts out a police bulletin to find Rogney and have him picked up. Daryl Rogney's prison record shows a conviction for manslaughter 18 years ago. It also shows that he was released from jail just before Andrew Walker's murder. 5 days after the murder, police finally locate him, but he looks different. He's shaved his head. When they bring Rogney in for questioning, he's difficult and evasive, pretending he's drunk and out of it. McGuire recognizes this kind of slippery behavior. He guesses that Rogney changed his appearance to disguise himself from police. Interesting, but not enough to make him a suspect, until McGuire spots what appears to be blood on his boot. Rogney's rap sheet tells police he's a dangerous man. With his fingerprints at the crime scene, blood on his boots, and his attempt at disguise, McGuire feels he has enough evidence to arrest him. He's counting on forensics to prove him right. In crime fiction, the boot would give him the evidence he needs. But this is true crime, and as McGuire will find out, things don't wrap up quite so neatly. Daryl Rogney, the prime suspect in the murder of Andrew Walker, is in jail. Detective McGuire has sent his boots to forensic biologist Cecilia Hagerman, hoping through DNA analysis to finally have solid physical evidence.
There was a small amount of blood found on those boots. However, no DNA profile was obtained from that small amount of blood.
A blow to McGuire's case. But Dr. Hagerman suggests a new line of investigation.
There was a significant amount of bleeding at the scene, And that would indicate to me that the best thing to look at would be the clothing of the suspect, because there would be a good chance of transfer of blood from the victim to the suspect.
And he didn't have his backpack when he was arrested, or some of his other clothing was missing as well. So I asked him, I said, look, you're going to be in jail for a while. Where's your stuff? We'll get it. And his comments were that, don't worry, you'll never find it. I've got it put away.
In detention, Rogney boasts to his cellmate that he doesn't care if they put him in a hellhole like the Don jail, because from the window he can keep an eye on the few possessions he owns. The windows of the Don jail look out on a ravine where homeless people live in makeshift shelters. What Rogney doesn't know is that his cellmate is an undercover detective.
Deep in the bushes, we located a plastic garbage bag, which, when torn open, contained a black backpack.
The backpack holds all the items that the officer at the scene of the crime had seen and cataloged in her notes, including the jacket, which she suspected was spattered with blood. This find is good news for investigators who are running short of evidence. But when Dr. Hagerman examines the blood on the backpack and jacket, it turns out to be Rogney's blood, not the victim's. As they prepare for trial, McGuire's worried. The case isn't strong enough to win a conviction. All they need is one piece of physical evidence that ties Rogney to the murder, and they still don't have it. Looking for a new perspective, McGuire returns to the crime scene. What has he missed? He starts with what he knows about the night of the murder, then tries to reconstruct the rest of it. Walker was fast asleep. Rogney was drinking in a nearby park. What happened next? Rogney is an angry, hyper-drunk, but Walker was sleeping so peacefully, so deeply, he wouldn't wake up. For some reason, that must have pushed Rogney over the edge. As McGuire retraces Rogney's path, he struggles to dig out one of the other cobblestones. It's harder than he thought. It suddenly dawns on McGuire that the killer might have left traces of his skin on the murder weapon.
I reminded her, Cecilia, you promised. I said, if we got to the point where this guy's going to walk out and it was the end of the line and the bottom of the list of priorities, you told me to look at the rock.
The blood on this rock, after DNA typing, was the victim's blood. That was no surprise. The question was whether or not the person who used this rock to bludgeon the victim also left his or her DNA on that rock in the form of perhaps skin cells.
And the preliminary hearing was running from a Monday to a Friday. And if we got past the Friday and we didn't have a match, then the gate would have opened and the accused and I would have walked out of court together.
The rock was quite dirty. There was lots of soil on it. When we did the DNA analysis of those swabs from the sides of the rock, the initial analysis did not work. We had to dilute the sample down in order to get the profile out. So we had what were called inhibitors to the process. But in this case, we were able to dilute them out and we were able to get a full DNA profile.
The skin cells found on the rock match Rogney's DNA profile, which puts the murder weapon in his hand. Midweek, a call comes in from Dr. Hagerman.
I answered the phone and I think her exact words were, Jesus, I hate it when the cops are right.
Finally, McGuire has got the evidence to nail Rogney. Both Rogney's fingerprints and the skin cells on the rock were collected in the first 72 hours after the crime. Cornered, destined for a long prison sentence, Rogney wants to talk.
He went on to tell a story about a man and a fight broke out, and this victim had grabbed him in a headlock and beat him up. And when he finished the story, I just said, I just don't believe it. None of it fit anything we knew about the victim. I mean, what he did was just very, very horrific. I don't doubt for a moment that, from what I know of his history and from my conversations with him, that some form of alcohol abuse has obviously played a big part in his life, and he's got extremely violent tendencies that he just simply has no control over.
Police have since solved the 2 other homeless murders. Each was committed by a different killer. Rogney is sentenced to 25 years in prison. But why did he kill this man? A drunken rage doesn't answer the question. It was a random act devoid of rationality. It was what we fear the most. Chaos striking in the heart of our ordered, everyday lives. The stories on 72 Hours are true. The detectives and forensic scientists are the ones who actually worked on the case. The names of the victims are fictitious. The names of the convicted are real.